So welcome everyone. Thank you Aviva and the ladies for organizing the refreshments. Greatly appreciated, and the ladies as well.
I didn't do anything. Aviva did it.
So today we're going to speak about the concept of exile. What is the function of exile? Why are times the Jewish people in exile? And how does one overcome the difficulty of exile? Because of course the danger of exile is that we totally lose our identity. The danger of exile is that we so get caught up in the exile that we forget who we are, what our purpose is, what our goals are, and we can, God forbid, become lost as an individual, and God forbid even worse, as a nation. The prototype for all exiles and all exodus, all exiles and all redemption from exile is and has always been the first exile, and that exile was the exile of Egypt, when the Jewish people descended into Egypt. And there were a few reasons why the Jewish people descended to Egypt. I will speak about it more closer to Pesach. But right now we are dealing in the book of Exodus, in Hebrew Shemot, which deals with the Jewish people descending into Egypt and then becoming exiled into Egypt, becoming slaves into Egypt, and then finally the miracles of the Exodus and the Exodus itself, and everything that the purpose of Exodus and what it led to, i.e. becoming a nation, forging a very unique relationship with God, becoming one with God through His holy Torah, through His holy instructions and His teachings. So in the very onset, we open up the book of Exodus, called in English Exodus, in Hebrew Shemot. The very first words are very powerful, very potent, and in fact contain within it the greatest and deepest message of exile and predominantly how to overcome the exile. In the very first verse, the book of Exodus in Hebrew is called Shemot. What does Shemot mean? Names. It's very odd that the whole book of Exodus, the first parasha, the first portion of the book of Shemot, of Exodus, is called Shemot, in the book of Shemot. So we find that the first portion, the first parasha, is called Shemot, it's called names, and the whole book is called the Sefer Shemot, the book of Shemot, the book of names. Why is it called names? In English it's very aptly called Exodus. It's not called exile, because exile was only it's a portion of this book. It's a smaller portion of the book. A. B, the point and purpose of exile is not to remain in exile. Exile is not a natural state for a Jew. The natural state for a Jew is to be free, physically free, spiritually free, and predominantly spiritually free. Exile is only a means to a goal, either to arouse us to a greater level of repentance, tshuva, or to look deeper within ourselves, to grow and to come closer to God, to reach a greater level of exodus. But ultimately, the natural state of a Jew is to be in a state, the natural state of spiritual freedom and exodus. So in English, it's very aptly named Exodus, because even the exile, the whole point of the exile is to reach exodus, to reach the level of growth, the ultimate, the redemption. That's really what the whole world is all about. So why in Hebrew is it called Shemot? In English, Exodus makes sense. Exodus, the redemption. So too, the book of Shemot and the parasha of Shemot should not be called, cannot be that the name is just conveniently called because the first or second word is Ve'ele Shemot, and these are the names of the Jewish people who are coming into Egypt. The Torah doesn't use convenience to teach us lessons. If this is the name of the parasha, of this portion, and it's the name of the whole book, must be that this is the very essence, represents the very core of what the whole book is all about. And indeed, such is the case. Whenever a parasha is called a particular name, or a book is called a particular name, It refers to its very essence and its most striking and most powerful lesson. So what is the lesson then to be learned from the parasha of Shemot and from the book of Shemot called Names? Let's first see how the parasha starts, how the very first the book starts. Ve'ele Shemot bnei Yisrael habayim Mitzrayma. These are the names of the Jewish people who are coming down to Egypt. Notice how it says who are coming down to Egypt, not who came. The Torah was given. When the Torah was revealed and given to us, the exile already occurred. So it should have addressed this incident as past tense. These are the names of the Jewish people that came to Egypt, not that are coming down to Egypt. The word, why does it use the present future? Because the concept of Egypt, as I mentioned, is a prototype for all exiles. The very name Egypt, the very word Egypt, spells Metzarim. It's the same spelling as Metzarim, which means boundaries, straits, limitations. All exiles are a limitation upon us. Limitations that are set upon us either by ourselves or by the Almighty God. Obviously, everything is by the Almighty God, but is it precipitated by God for us to reach a higher level, or is it precipitated by us in order to rectify something and thus then be awakened and aroused to reach a higher level? But be it as it may, all exiles are really Metzarim or Mitzrayim. All exiles are boundaries and limitations. Boundaries and limitations because we may live in a foreign land. Boundaries and limitations set upon us by the governments that we have throughout times, even the times of the Talmud. The times of the Talmud, it speaks about, for example, in the Mishnah, that the Jews were fearful of lighting Shabbat candles because of the Zoroastrian religion of the time that worshipped fire, and there were times that you were allowed to light flames, and the times that you weren't allowed to light flames. So you had to be in total darkness. And Jews celebrate the Shabbat and the festivals through lighting the Shabbat candles. Unfortunate was the time that the days of darkness fell on the same time that we had to light the Shabbat candles. It was a very fearful and frightful times. There were times that we weren't allowed to keep Brit Milah, Shabbat, study Torah, etc. throughout our history. And then there are times that there is great affluence, the great or assimilation, or these different types of things that places boundaries and limitations upon us. So all exiles are limitations. And therefore, the fact that it says Habayim, that are coming, present, future, refers to all exiles, which means that the lesson of this exile and the lesson of the redemption that could be learned from this exile and to achieve redemption are applicable to all exiles. And what are they? If the Torah wanted to simply just list the names of the people who are coming to Egypt, so we'll know them for posterity, for history's sake, then the Torah could have said, these are the Jewish people, or the Jewish people who are coming down to Egypt, and these are their names. Why does it say, these are the names that came down to Egypt? A name doesn't come down to Egypt, a person comes down to Egypt that has a name. So you could have said, Ve'ele, and these are Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people who are coming down to Egypt, or came down to Egypt. Ve'ele Shemotam, and these are their names. Why does it say, these are the names that are coming down to Egypt? Almost indicating that it's the names that came down to Egypt. First of all, the Torah wants to highlight to us the importance of Jewish names. Jewish name is very powerfully important, and it connects us to our past. Now, the book of Shemot is the second book of the Torah, correct? Okay. Notice how the book starts, Ve'ele Shemot. It's a new book, right? But it starts Ve'ele, and these are the names. Now, the letter Vav in Hebrew is a connecting letter. Ve, and is like a continuation. You never start a sentence with the word and, right? Do you start a whole paragraph with the letter or the word and? Of course not. Would you start a whole book? Can you imagine a book? You buy a book, and you open up the book and it says, and once upon a time. You don't find and. Come on, Helene, you don't find that.
Well, she's thinking. not educated in our way.
But the fact is, if we were educated in your way, you would never start a book and...
Never start
'Cause
a
it-
sentence. with
That's
it.
correct. Because it comes to tell us that the names of the Jewish people connect us to our past. What was the first book? The first book was of our ancestors, the history of our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. How do we connect? How do we connect to our ancestors? Through our Jewish name. This is a very important concept. The name, the Jewish name, is an identity. And therefore it represents our identity. It represents our connection with our identity. Which means that despite the fact that later on we see that the Jewish people descended to a very, very low level in Egypt, almost assimilating the culture of the Egyptians into their own lives, but there were certain things that they always kept apart. Their language, their dress, their moral conduct as far as family is concerned. They were always pure in the family interrelationships, and their names. Seems that these three, and from the Torah to be able to say and call the whole Exodus, the book of Exodus, names, seems to place a lot of importance of the names itself. One of the merits by which the Jewish people merited the Exodus was the fact that they kept their names, because names shows that you have an identity. And no matter how far you may have descended, how low you may have descended, it shows that you still have a connection, you still have an identity. And that identity connects you to your past and can never be forgotten. There is a rule in Judaism that in laws in kashrut, for example, and other laws, the application is in other laws as well, that things are nullified in the majority, right? So, for example, let's say you have a little bit of non-kosher drink that somehow came here by accident, and a little bit was poured, and then a lot later, somehow got mixed up. It's nullified in the majority. But something that is special, something that is unique, something that has its own individual identity is never nullified. So the Jewish people are not only a group of people that comprise a nation and make a nation, they are a group of individuals as well, of which each person individually has their identity. And that is a powerful thing. According to the laws of the Torah, this is something that can never be nullified. Can never be nullified. It's like oil. You take oil, you throw it in water, you throw it in juice, you throw it whatever it is, it'll always float. It will never intermingle, never mix. It will always remain itself. Even though you throw it into a pool of other things, of other ingredients, it will never mix. It will always remain unique, singular, individual. And so too. No matter what, no matter where you throw the Jewish people, they have the power and they have the ability to remain distinct. As we say in the Haggadah, Mitsuyanim, the Jewish people were distinct. Even though they were there, they were oppressed, and it was difficult, and it's very hard to maintain your identity in a very powerfully oppressive nation, especially if the nation is the greatest nation on earth. We know that the Jewish people rarely assimilate to a nation that is despicable in its eyes. The Jewish nation will not aspire to mix with a nation that is despicable, that has a very low level of culture, that behave like animals. In the past, for example, like the Persians, the Jews were never mixed, never intermingled with the Persians, so they looked down upon them. But with the Hellenists, with the Greeks, that were very much into philosophy and into culture, that was alluring, that was attracting. But not something very low nation, they're not into it. So therefore, the Jewish people, no matter where they are, have the ability and the power to remain distinct. Now, you can well imagine that if the Jewish people were oppressed for such a long time in the most powerful, most affluent, and most respected nation in the world, you can imagine, you can guess that there's going to be a level of assimilation. But nonetheless, the Jewish people have the power to transcend that. And that is signified in the fact that they kept their names. Names is an identity. However, having said that, there's something very, very important that we must understand about a name. For you yourself, do you need a name? Do you need a name? You don't need a name. You know who you are. You don't need to call yourself. You wake up in the morning and you say, hey, Sarah, is that you? Yes. Yes, it's me. You don't need a name for yourself. You know who you are. You don't need to call yourself. When do you have a name? You only need a name, someone else, other people, when you interact with something outside of yourself. Does the name reflect your essence, your core, and who you are? No, absolutely not, because you don't need a name for yourself. You don't need a name for yourself. You only need a name for others. And does the name, if I look at your name, will I know exactly your quality, who you are, your essence? No, absolutely not. I can look at two people who have the name Moshe, and they can be opposites. Two people who have the name Rahel can be absolute opposites. The name Rahel or the name doesn't depict the essence of who you are. Yes, it contains a spiritual energy, absolutely. And it has a connection to your identity, but it is not your essence, your core, and not your intrinsic identity, not at all. It's something external of you. When we call God by a name, it's not the essence of God. When we call God King, it's a description. When we call God kind, it's a description. It's not his essence, not his core. It doesn't have a name. Calling your name. Not to worry. So what is the meaning? What is it coming to teach us? What is it coming to tell us? It comes to tell us a powerful thing. There are a few parts of the soul of the neshama. There is a part of the neshama that always remains with God. It's pristine. It's holy. It's unadulterated. It can never be affected no matter what. Wherever we go, whatever we do, wherever we may descend, that part of the soul is pristine, is holy, is always a part of God. Never affected. Then there is a part of the soul that descends from level to level to level to level until it reaches this physical world, by which it says, "Vayipach ba'apav nishmat hayim," and God blew within his nostrils the breath of life. And then there's a fusion between the spirit, the soul, and the body. That's not the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is too high, too beyond to being clothed in a body. It's too powerful. It's like you're taking a 10,000 volt of electricity and you're putting it into a 5 volt light bulb. What would happen to the light bulb? Burst, explode. I'd like to see that. But that's what would happen. It's too powerful. So too, the body is very lowly, it's very humble, is material, it's coarse. Can you imagine if the essence of the soul would be embedded in the body would not be able to take it. Let me give you an example. The prophets, for example, when they prophesied, unlike Moshe Rabbeinu, because he was totally holy and pure, when they prophesied, they only prophesied either in a dream or in a state of sorry?
Vision?
Either in a dream or in a trance, where the body was totally, like in a state of epilepsy, like in a fit. The prophet would fall on the floor and would shake. Why? Because his body was not able to absorb in a conscious way, in an awake manner, the prophecy of God. It's just too powerful. Moshe Rabbeinu could. He was the only prophet that could. Moshe Rabbeinu, whilst he was awake, in a clear, unambiguous prophecy, would prophesy. All other prophets did not. They saw a vision or a dream, but their body was in a state of slumber or in a state of, what do they call it, when in a fit? Had a trance or a fit, because couldn't take it. Couldn't take it. So too, the soul is too powerful. The whole soul, the essence of the soul, the core of the soul, is too powerful to be enclosed in the body. So what then is enclosed in the body? A part of the soul. And that is what the Torah calls it, the name. These are the names of the Jewish people that are coming down to Egypt. And what's the name? The name is only something that we said is external to you. It's not the essence. So the Torah is telling us, these are the names, only names come down to Egypt. Not the Bnei Yisrael themselves, not the essence of the Jewish people themselves, not that part of us that is the very core and the very essence, that always stays with God. A, because it's too powerful to enter in the body. B, it is that part of us that is always attached to God, that no matter where we go and how low we may descend, we can always arise. Because we always have that connection to God. So that part within us, even though it may slumber, that soul, which we now are referring to as a name, because a name refers to something that is external of you, it's not your essence, your core, that is that part that can descend to an Egypt and can descend to limitations and is subject somewhat to the limitations of exile. But our essence and our core always remains free and is totally independent of this material world. And that is that part of us that is always connected, that even though that we may spiritually be in a state of slumber, be in a state of sleep, our soul is always awake. Ani yeshena v'libi ayed. Like it says in the verse. Ani yeshena v'libi ayed. I am asleep, but my heart is always awake. Which refers to that part of the soul that's always awake, never slumbers. So we may slumber in exile. We may become somewhat forgetful of who we are and what we are, but there is a part of us that is always part of God that never forgets. And that can never be damaged, that can never be tainted. And that will be that part which will always allow us to be aroused, to maintain a connection to God. And we see this throughout times. There were times, difficult times, where the Jewish people had very, very difficult times, yet they were always able to maintain their identity. If you think about it, if you look historically, the majority, almost always, unless the conquering nation was a benevolent conquering nation, quite often, if it wasn't benevolent, it would swallow up the smaller nations, or even big nations. It would swallow them up, and they would adopt their culture, they would adopt their religion. Very rare that a nation, especially a minority, and a minority of a minority, the small of the small, would retain their identity. Very unique. The Jewish people were able to do it throughout times. Why? Because we have that power and that strength, because that which descends in exile and that which is affected by the conditions of exile is only the external part of us. The internal part of us is always free. And no power in the world can control it, no power in the world can limit it in any way, shape or form. And that is the lesson to be learned. We may descend in exile, but it's not the essence of the soul that descends in exile. Therefore, we are always intrinsically free. We are not subject, our essence and our core is not subject to the conditions around us. And that is why you find that Jews throughout times were willing to give up their lives, to sacrifice their lives for their religion. And that's why we're here today. Because this has been the case throughout times. So we'll just finish off the concept and then we'll take some questions after that. So this is what the Torah wants to tell us. That's why it's called the Book of Names. That's why the Exodus is not called Exodus. It's called the Book of Names. Because it wants to tell us that if we ever fall into exile, just as we've fallen into exile in the past, and if we may ever fall into exile in the future, it'll only be our name that is in exile, not our essence and not our core. Because nothing can control us. Nothing has the power over the essence of the core and the core. And again, that is why throughout times we've seen people that have perhaps either been brought up totally assimilated or secular to Judaism, all of a sudden suddenly have a feeling towards coming close to Judaism. We see it in our times. In the last couple of decades, we see a phenomenal return of Jewish people who had no connection to Judaism. Their parents and even their grandparents had no connection to Judaism. In fact, sometimes they were antagonistic towards the concept of religion. Because it was so, they thought that they didn't know anything about it, so they looked at it as something archaic, ancient history. And yet their children, or their children's children, are somehow embracing Judaism. To the extent that it's a realization of the prophecy of Elijah there, he says, Veheshiv lev avot al banim. That the children will return the hearts of the fathers. Even those children who, if the hearts of the fathers are not with Judaism, so to speak, so you can well imagine that the children have not been brought up in Judaism. How is it possible that the parents who maybe were exposed a little bit to Judaism, or if the parents weren't exposed to any Judaism at all, how is it that their children are exposed to no Judaism whatsoever? They will return the hearts of the parents. This is what the Torah tells us. Because it is the power of the soul. No matter who you are, no matter what you are, no matter who your parents were, no matter where you grew up, no matter how difficult the conditions were. Look at the Jews in Russia. It's phenomenal. How they thirsted for that tiny little bit of Judaism. How they somehow rallied around anything small and minutely associated with Judaism. Look at Natan Sharansky, that doesn't know, what did he know about Judaism at the time? Sat in jail for who knows how many. The power of the soul. The power of the soul. So from this we have to understand that our core never goes into exile. It is only the external part of our soul that goes into exile. Therefore, we have to understand that we should never give up hope. We should never give up hope, no matter how difficult it may be. And the exile in Egypt was very, very difficult. It was very, very difficult indeed. So difficult that you can imagine Amram, that was the leader of the Jewish people, decided to separate from his wife. And if he did it, he was the leader of he was the chief rabbi of the time. All the nation separated from their wives. That's how difficult it was, because they didn't want to bring babies to the world that are going to die. They're going to be put to death. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Who wants to see their kid killed in front of them? Nobody. That's how difficult it was. Very hard to go through it. The Egyptians made their lives miserable. They would wake them up in the middle of the night. They would send them into the woods to get nonsense, just to make them suffer. That's why all of the 10 plagues are an exact corresponding to the suffering that they brought upon the Jewish people. They themselves received back. So that's an important thing that we have to learn. That the core and the essence is always pristine, and that we must never give up hope. Some people think that, I wasn't brought up religious, or, I'm 40, I'm 50, I'm 60, I'm 70 years old. It's too late for me. Not the case at all. The power of the soul is so powerful, is so intense, that we can make an unbelievable 180-degree turn. Look at Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was a total ignoramus, didn't know how to read. Rabbi Akiva, 40 years old. 40 years old. Yet he was inspired by his to-be bride to go and because she saw something in him. She saw a quality within him. Rabbi Akiva, the Talmud says, was in fact, I want to say anti-religious, but he was. The Talmud says he was anti the scholars, because unfortunately, an ignoramus who has nothing to say for himself will be jealous of those who have prominence, position, or knowledge, and therefore they belittle them, they put them down. Like one time there was a woman who berated a rabbi. So the son of the rabbi saw this and was very upset. He said, "Why do you let this woman berate?" He said, "Nah, she's just upset because I made a halachic decision that didn't go her way. That's why she's berating me, not because she really means it." He says, "How do you know?" He says, "I'll prove it to you." And he calls the lady in. And he says, "Tell me, if I were to give you a blessing to have a child like me, would you like it?" "Oh, Rabbi, that would be the greatest blessing that you could ever give me." "Well, I give you a blessing that your children should be scholars like me." And the lady left. You see, he turned to his son and said, "You see, she has nothing against me per se. It's just that." So too as well. Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva was against the scholars. So that's how bad he was. That's how removed he was from Torah and from scholarship. Yet slowly, step by step, and it wasn't easy. Don't think it was easy. Step by step, he became one of the greatest scholars of all time, of all Jewish history. if it wasn't for Rabbi Akiva, we would not have Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition as passed down to us in the written format of the Mishnah, because his students were the ones, and his students were the ones that wrote down. Rabbi Meir was his disciple. Rabbi Meir, if it wasn't for Rabbi Meir, we would not have the Mishnah. The Mishnah started from Rabbi Meir, went on to Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Meir was the one who began the whole concept of transcribing the oral Torah, because understanding that the times of exile are coming, and no longer can we just rely on the fact that the teacher will teach the disciple everything orally. They had to at least transcribe the essence of the oral Torah, which was always orally. They all had to transcribe it at least in note form, at least in short form, to be able to develop it from there. And so on and so forth. Throughout times, there have been people who have not given up on themselves, no matter what age, no matter how difficult the situation was. This is an important lesson for us. We are also in exile. Our exile is different. Our exile is because we live in a very selfish environment. We live in an environment of plenty, and unfortunately sometimes, as the Torah says, Vayishman Yishurun Vayivat, when we wax fat, when we have everything good, sometimes we become arrogant and we rebel against God. When we are in need, so we have no choice, so we turn to God. But when we have everything, sometimes we forget about God. Sometimes we feel self-reliant. When a person is poverty-stricken or in exile, he has no choice, he realizes he's not self-reliant. When a person suddenly becomes sick, all of his wealth won't help him anything. Suddenly he becomes humble, etc., etc. So we're also in exile. But in this exile, we have to understand that our core has not gone into exile. Only our something that is external. And therefore, we have to learn never to give up, and also learn that we have the power to overcome. Intrinsically, we are spiritually free. We are spiritually empowered. And that is one of the most important lessons, not only for the exile of Egypt, but for all exiles. And that's what uses the expression, that are coming to Egypt, because it's a lesson for all time. There's one more lesson that I want to be able to speak about, and then we can take the questions. The other lesson is we mentioned before, is that the concept of name is external, right? External. Yet we find something very powerful about a name. What, for example? The sages tell us that if a person is asleep, or if a person is in a deep slumber, or even if a person is faints, call their name. Call their name, it arouses them. Something special about the name that arouses the person within him. In the Megillah, when we're about to read in a few weeks Megillat Esther, it says, Balayla hahu nadada shnat hamelech. On that night, the king's slumber was aroused. What does it mean? And who is this king? Everything about the Megillah is a metaphor about the Jewish people in exile and God the king. The Midrash says that any time that it says the word king without Ahashverosh, just king simply, the Midrash says it refers to God himself. It's an allusion to God. The whole story of the Megillah is how God hides behind the veil of nature. And therefore, even in the Megillah, how God hides and the miracle is hidden through the little things, the little miracles that occurred. So that's why the Midrash says that anytime it says Hamelech, just the king, it doesn't refer to Ahashverosh, it refers to God, the king of all kings. When it says Hamelech Ahashverosh, the king Ahashverosh, it refers to King Ahashverosh. But just Hamelech refers to the king himself. It's an allusion to something happening in heaven, not only just below, because anything that happens below is really something happening in heaven and trickling down and arousing down below. So when the slumber of the king of all kings was aroused, so to speak, King Ahashverosh was also aroused. And that was when the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people started to occur, or part of the beginning. was when Ahasuerus couldn't sleep because he was having bad dreams. He had bad dreams that someone wants to kill him, execute him. Someone wants to overtake his throne. And all of a sudden, Haman comes in the door in the middle of the night, telling how he wants to kill Mordechai. So just before that happens, the king wakes up and he can't sleep, and he calls his chamberlain and he says, "Listen, I can't sleep. Look in the records. Maybe I didn't pay back a debt. Maybe I didn't pay back a debt to those who were loyal to me, because I don't know, I'm having these bad dreams, but I'm not getting any warnings." And they said, "Yes, indeed. A couple of years back, 2 people, Bigtana Vateresh, wanted to murder the king, but Mordechai knew about it and he came and he told you." "Oh, well, did we reward him?" "No. Lo na'asai mo davar. We didn't reward him." "Oh, that's no good at all. That's no good at all. Oh, now I didn't reward him. Now maybe he won't warn me again." That's what happened down below. What happened in heaven? What happened in heaven was, what does it mean when we slumber? What does it mean when we slumber? Of course, God doesn't sleep and God doesn't slumber. But what does it mean that God's slumber was aroused? The king's slumber was aroused. I'll tell you what it means. When you sleep, if you look at someone who's sleeping, you cannot tell who he is, and his talents are totally asleep. And in fact, when they dream, the subconscious, they don't think consciously, and therefore their thoughts have mixed and opposing factors to it. You can dream about a ship flying. A ship doesn't fly, a ship sails, right? An airplane flies. You can dream about an airplane that's sailing with a sail on it. You can dream very weird things. You can dream about an elephant. The Gemara says about an elephant who's going through a pinhole. Is that possible? It's not possible. When a person is asleep, you cannot recognize their talents. You cannot tell anything about them. When a person is awake, their talents are awake. If he's a poet, if he's an artist, or whatever the case, when you're asleep, you don't recognize that the person is not able to reveal his talent. The fact, so to speak, that the Midrash, so to speak, allegorically says that God was asleep, it doesn't mean that God was asleep. It means that our relationship was asleep. It means that we were slumbering, we were asleep. The quality of the Jewish people that defined them as God's people was asleep. It was asleep. Wasn't recognizable who we are, what we are, and our quality. When Mordechai gathered the Jewish people and aroused them and caused them to do tshuva, caused them to repent and caused them to cleave to the Torah, unquestionably, then we were aroused. Then our talents, our inner talents, our core was revealed. Our talents were revealed. What is our talents? Our talents is our great faith and commitment to God. That is the talent of a Jew. That was revealed. When that was revealed, when that was awakened, so to speak, the king was awakened. And that began the process of redemption of the miracle of Purim. So too. When we slumber, when our talents, when we forget who we are, when we get consumed by the exile, either because of the difficulty of the exile, because we've been oppressed, or for whatever reasons, because of the influence around us, or we forget our identity, we have to be reminded of our identity. We have to be reminded of who we are. Remember, one of the explanations of why it's called Shemot is because Shemot is identity. We're cleaving, we're holding to our identity. If you hold to your identity, you have something. When we are in exile, we are like in slumber, like in a sleep. As it says, David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Hayinu keholmim. When we're exiled, we're like dreamers. And when dreamers, opposite things happen, things that doesn't make sense happen. So too, it doesn't make sense for a Jew to part from God and the way of God. It doesn't make sense. It only happens in exile. So how do we overcome that? By calling a name. When you call a name, when we try and arouse within ourselves our identity of who we are, we can in fact arouse the very core of our neshama, the very essence of our soul. Because don't forget, when I call you, even though your name is external to you, right? But when I call you, what do you do? What do you do when I call you? You turn to me. Your whole being, your whole face is directed towards me. Who you are, what you are, turns to me. Correct? So too, a name is external. But the name also represents a form of identity, a form of closeness. And therefore, when the Jewish people, so to speak, God is calling the Jewish people's name in exile, we have the ability to awaken from our slumber and have the power that our very core, which is immensely powerful. It's a steamroller. Nothing can stand in its way. Nothing. But it has to be aroused. It has to be awakened, like the sleeping giant. You awaken it, you overcome the exile. So too, the Jewish people in a very precarious situation in Egypt. They were a very precarious situation in the story of Haman. They were going to be killed, every single Jew. Every single Jew. Why? Because they were in a state of spiritual slumber. Because they were in a state of spiritual slumber, their very essence was endangered. They were forgetting who they are. They were endangering their existence in exile. They're becoming too involved in the exile. But when they were aroused, when Mordechai called their name and aroused their identity, their core was aroused and nothing could move them anymore. They were so devoted to God's Torah and God's law that they were immovable, unshakable. Unshakable. They couldn't care less. What tomorrow brings, they couldn't care. Today, we are God's people. No matter what. You think that, if anything, run away. Run away, hide. Go to a city where nobody knows you, and maybe you can save yourself. They knew that they were going to be killed. You go and save yourself. Change your name. Change your name. Instead of Ovadia, call yourself Ahmed. And then you can hide, and nobody will find you, nobody will touch you. No. They stood like a mountain, immovable, unshakable. They were aroused. They were aroused from their sleep and their slumber. So to speak, this caused an arousal from heaven, that their part, so to speak, that is attached to God, was aroused, and they felt it. And they were willing to give up their lives for Judaism. We're not running away. We're staying put. We're staying still. We are immovable. And this was a success then. This was a success in Egypt, where they were almost totally assimilated. But they had their identity. And that name that they never changed, that name that was called, so to speak, aroused really from the depth of who they were, and teaches us that we have the strength as a nation, as individuals, to overcome all of this. And that is why it's called Shemot, and that is why it's called names, as opposed to the Exodus. As our custom, our practice when we have the shiur for ladies, and my wife always tells me, listen, don't philosophize, don't go on all this stuff, just say stories. Women love stories. Say stories. Say stories. So we have a custom that we have the ladies shiur in order to satisfy my wife that she doesn't, criticize me later on. We say stories. So I want to tell you, we'll see how much time we have for stories, and then we have the questions. We all, every single one of us, and it happens to me, and it happens to you, find ourselves in situations that we don't want to be. We don't want to be in this situation. Why are we here? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Why am I in this job? I don't want to be in this job. I don't want to be doing this. This boss, and there's this, and there's that.
Oprah.
There's an interesting story that there was a mahloket, there was a dispute amongst a part of the body. Who's boss? So the brain said, I'm boss. What do you mean? I think, I direct everything, feeling, everything goes through me. The heart says, no, I'm boss. Without me ticking, you're worthless. I'm the one that passes the blood through the body, the breath. Without me, without breath, what is your brain? Finished. You're brain dead. You're gone. Finished. The eye says, no, without me, you don't see where you're going. The neck said, no, I'm boss. So everybody started to laugh. What do you mean you're boss? You're nothing. What are you? We can live without you. I said, really? I'll show you. And the neck started to tense all of its muscle, and there was such a big neck ache, such a pain in the neck, that the eyes started to water, couldn't see where it was going. The brain couldn't think, and the heart had to tick double. And after a week, they all gave in. They said, your boss. Your boss. So you see, to be boss, you don't have to be a brain, you don't have to have a good heart. All you have to be is a pain in the neck. So sometimes we find ourselves that we're working for a pain in the neck, that he's our boss, and we're difficult. Exile is also a time that we should also be aware that we shouldn't want to be in exile. It's not pleasant for us. It's not where we should be. So there is the communal exile, and then there's individual exiles where every single one of us goes through difficulties. One time there was a Jew, it's a true story, who was in the previous story wasn't, I don't know, yeah, it's probably true. Probably true. There was a Jew in Jerusalem who was very poor, and his job was, he was a street cleaner. He would clean the streets, just, with his broom and pick up the thing and put it in the bin. That was his job. And he was quite miserable about it. Imagine, very lowly, very humble, what type of job that is. And, but at least he'd go home at night and his family would cheer him up and he'd go home and he'd be with his kids and his wife and, and that would keep him going. But one day even that couldn't do it anymore. He thought to himself, my kids, what do they think of me probably? And maybe they think ill of me. And what am I? Just a poor little street cleaner. And he began to become depressed. And he hated his job, and he couldn't believe what is it that he's doing there, and all of a sudden, he would come home and he just couldn't handle it, and his wife and his children tried to cheer him up, but nothing was working. Nothing was working, and he was falling into a deeper and deeper depression. He found it very hard to even the whistling that he used to whistle whilst he was doing the street cleaning, that didn't help. Nothing helped him. The kids tried to cheer him up. Nothing helped him. The wife made him his favorite burnt toast. Even that didn't help him. Nothing helped. And one day he was sweeping the streets. And there was a windy day, so whenever he would sweep a little bundle, the wind would come and throw it away, and he felt terrible. He felt hopeless. And all of a sudden, he hears a voice saying, "I'm jealous of you." He thought, now really cracking up. And the voice says again, "I'm jealous of you." And he turns around and he sees a rabbi, a short man with a beautiful white beard, with a beautiful smiling face. If you saw a picture of him, you'd know. His name was Rabbi Aryeh Levin. He was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful human being and rabbi, full of love and empathy. And he says, "I'm jealous of you." He says, "Why? Rabbi, why are you jealous of me? You're jealous of me. You're a rabbi, you're a scholar. You for sure have a better life than me." By the way, Rabbi Aryeh Levin used to live in a house this big, literally this big. And he had a lot of people of influence that loved him, because he was a rabbi that before the establishment of the State of Israel, he would visit all of the jails. Religious, not religious, couldn't care. He endangered himself, he risked himself. He would pass messages from the family to the people in the jail. Those people who fought against the British Mandate and all of that, some of them were killed. And he would be with them, and would be by them in the darkest hours. And when the State of Israel was established, they loved him. He was their hero. He was their rabbi, and they came to visit him. And he lived in a little house, literally small, tiny house. So just to show you how humble and how simple he lived. And they asked him, "Rabbi, why are you living in such a small house? We'll buy you a bigger house." He says, "No, don't bother." He says, "Why?" They asked him. He says, "Because the difference between this house and the grave is very, very small, so I'm not going to really feel a big difference after 120 years when the time comes. After all, this world, we're only here to do good. We don't know, what's the big deal? The soul, the world to come, that's our rightful place. But this world, the body's anyway going to end up down there, and not such a big difference." So this rabbi sees this guy, and obviously he saw in his face that something was amiss, was not right. And he says, "I'm jealous of you." He says, "Why are you jealous of Rabbi? You're a rabbi, you're a scholar, you're a teacher." He says, "I'm jealous of you because you clean the palace of the king. Jerusalem is the palace of the king. That's God's city. And you have the privilege and pleasure of cleaning the palace of the king and making it ready for the divine presence to reside in the holy city of Jerusalem. I'm jealous of you. I'm jealous of you." And ever since then, he felt on top of the world. Ever since then, he felt that he has a role, he has a function. It doesn't matter, ladies, where and what we are. We may be in difficult times. We may work for a boss that's a pain in the neck. We may be even a street cleaner. But we all have a function and a role that is chosen by God himself the King of all kings. And we have a function, and we have a role. And therefore we should never fall into depression. We should understand that we have a neshama, and that neshama is attached to God, and that we only have to call its name to be able to arouse us from our sleep and from our slumber, and always to be attached to God and know that we have the power to do so.